Let's pick up where we left off in this greatest of stories, following Jesus through his final days in Jerusalem, learning alongside the disciples that his blood must be poured out for many, and that the good news of his resurrection must be proclaimed to the whole world. Join us as we journey with Jesus to the cross and beyond the Gospel of Mark.
Well, hey everyone, if you've been here in the last year, you know that we're chasing an Awake the Lake vision for our region. That vision calls us to imagine if by 2035, a new dawn has arrived where 30,000 people have been mobilized to step into their kingdom calling to bring gospel influence into the everyday places of life. Now, in order to actualize this vision, our mission for Grace Church is that individually and collectively, all together, we're following Jesus as we live out God's story every day, everywhere. Every day, everywhere. That's a lot. Actually, that's all the time, in all the places. I can think of a few of you who are consistently living that out. I can think of a lot of us, myself included, who have room to grow. Now, one of the things the leaders at Grace have done over the last couple of years is turn to the scriptures to understand what Jesus-shaped disciples look like. And we're calling these dream disciple roles, and we've got 4 of them: savvy follower, compassionate storyteller, embedded influencer, and intentional friend. Now, we may have given these roles memorable names and branding, but they are rooted in the ancient ways and practices of Jesus and the early church. So today, as we near the end of Mark's story, I want us to consider what it means to be an embedded influencer, someone who can say, I understand how God has purposely gifted and positioned me to multiply his work in the world. And we're going to consider this from the perspective of a first century Jewish leader, and then look at it from our own unique perspective. So let's start with some context for where we're at in Mark's story. Yesterday, Thursday, was Passover, the day of the Passover meal. And Jesus sat down with his disciples at sundown for the Last Supper. Now, it's Friday evening, and Jesus is hanging dead on a cross. And in the next hour or two, the sun will go down, signaling the beginning of the Jewish Sabbath. And no work can be done on the Sabbath, and that certainly includes hauling a dead body to a grave. Now, those who might wish to bury Jesus don't actually have the means to do so. They can't march past the Roman centurions surrounding the cross, take Jesus' body down and haul it away. First of all, Pilate would have to give them permission. And second, it was the usual thing to leave bodies hanging there for a while. Days even. Let the birds pick away as a warning to other would-be insurrectionists and traitors to Rome. Now, even if Jesus' disciples could somehow get the body down, where would they take it? The crucified body couldn't be buried just anywhere. The Jews had laws about not burying condemned criminals alongside the pious, so they were usually given a shallow grave somewhere. Now, wealthier families, they had tombs cut into the rocky hillsides where bodies would lay for about a year or so, and then they would collect the bones in something called an ossuary in order to make room for other bodies, because everyone dies eventually after all. And this is the kind of tomb where Jesus' body finds an unexpected resting place. And the way that he gets there is through an unlikely hero. In Mark chapters 14 and 15, we've been introduced to a host of new characters. In the last couple of weeks, we've met the high priest Caiaphas, who condemned Jesus as a blasphemer, the Roman governor Pilate, who substituted Jesus for Barabbas. We met Cyrene of Cyrene, who carried the cross, and his sons Rufus and Alexander. We met a Roman centurion who was the first person to proclaim the divinity of Christ, saying, truly, this man was the Son of God. And today we meet one more. His name is Joseph of Arimathea, a respected member of the council. Now, this is the first time he's mentioned by Mark. Matthew, Luke, and John, they also name him at this point in the story. This is also the last time we hear his name in the New Testament. But for now, let's read how his life intersects with Jesus at this moment. And when evening had come, since it was the day of preparation, that is, the day before the Sabbath, Joseph of Arimathea, a respected member of the council, who was also himself looking for the kingdom of God, took courage and went to Pilate and asked for the body of Jesus. Pilate was surprised to hear that he should have already died, and summoning the centurion, he asked him whether he was already dead. And when he learned from the centurion that he was dead, he granted the corpse to Joseph. And Joseph bought a linen shroud, and taking him down, wrapped him in the linen shroud, and laid him in a tomb that had been cut out of the rock. And he rolled a stone against the entrance of the tomb. Mary Magdalene and Mary, the mother of Joseph, saw where he was laid. Now, at this moment in the Passion narrative, all eyes are normally on Jesus. And all the other major players, well, they're out of the picture, right? Like, where's Peter and the others? We don't know for sure. But what we do know is that all four gospel writers place women at the cross and the tomb. And all four named Joseph of Arimathea as the man who buried Jesus. So who is he? Well, most likely he's a Pharisee, and he's from the region that's northwest of Jerusalem. He's named by Mark as a member of the council because he's part of the Sanhedrin. That's that ruling body consisting of the high priest and 70 influential men. So he isn't just any Jewish man or even just any Pharisee. He is what we might call an embedded influencer. As a Pharisee, he's got influence over the Jewish people and their day-to-day lives. Remember, the Pharisees were hawk-like in their attention to the details of the law and how to interpret the law. We've seen them all through Mark's story. Jesus challenges them time and again on their methods of interpretation because they work so hard to appear holy and pious on the outside, obeying every letter of the law, but missing the heart of God completely. Now, Joseph's influence extends beyond his local community into the highest circles of Jewish power. He is one of the chosen, one of the 70. He presumably has an audience with the high priest, other important Pharisees, Sadducees, scribes. Anybody who is anybody is connected to this ruling body of Jewish elites. And so Joseph of Arimathea, he's kind of a big deal. And so we're going to focus our attention on him, not forgetting about Jesus. This is, after all, Jesus' story from start to finish. But at the moment, I want to understand how Joseph's story intersects with Jesus' story, because I think that you and I have something to learn about our own stories and our own influence. So let's look at 3 lessons for the embedded influencer from Joseph of Arimathea. Lesson number 1, be aware you have influence. I'll be honest, when we first developed these dream disciple roles, embedded influencer was the hardest one for me to accept, not because I don't think I have had or do have influence, but because it isn't something that I necessarily desire or want to achieve. And that feels weird to say in a world where our kids are increasingly trading dreams of being professional athletes for dreams of being YouTube influencers. But what I'm saying is that there are different kinds of embedded influencers in the church today. There are those of us who need to be encouraged to look at our influence as a positive thing. And some of us just need to slow our roll, not get ahead of ourselves, thinking we're destined to influence millions when we should just really start with the 4 people in our own house. All of us need to be aware that right now we are embedded somewhere. You might be able to easily name where you're an outsider trying to get in or at the bottom trying to climb to the top, but I want you to think about where you're already at the center. Because you are at the center somewhere, in your family unit, with your circle of friends, on your sports team, in your classroom, at your office. Where is this space for you? Name those spaces and be aware you have influence there. Look at Joseph of Arimathea. As a member of the council, he had influence, and he uses it here. I mean, not just anyone could go to Pilate and ask for the body of a condemned, crucified criminal, but Joseph can. Pilate's only hesitation is his surprise that Jesus is dead so soon. But confirmation by the centurion puts his mind at ease about that, so he gives the okay, the thumbs up for Joseph to take the body from the cross to his own tomb. And this action, coupled with Mark's comment that Joseph was looking for the kingdom of God, well, it's a clue for Mark's audience, then and now, that Joseph is at some level a Jesus follower. Now, what may have been curiosity and cautious hope, well, that has leveled up, and Joseph works up the courage to use his influence with the Roman governor to get the body, and then uses his own tomb to bury that body. We might let these facts blow right by us as we read, but each of these actions would have surprised the ancient audience, and taken together they're truly shocking, and here's why. Because Joseph's actions and attitude demonstrate that he is treating Jesus as if he were a family member, like his very own flesh and blood. And who would do that for a crucified criminal? Why would he do it? Well, we'll get to those answers. But first, let's back up in the story. Because we know that less than 24 hours ago, all the chief priests and the elders and the scribes came together. And this means Joseph was present at the high priest's midnight trial of Jesus. And remember that the arrest, trial, and death of Jesus had been carefully planned. The whole council didn't just happen to be at the high priest's house in the middle of Passover night on accident. They had orchestrated this kangaroo court. And we know that Joseph didn't speak up at the trial to defend Jesus because when Caiaphas tore his robes and demanded a verdict, Mark tells us that they all condemned him as deserving death. So we've got Joseph as a member of the Sanhedrin. He's this embedded influencer, and he's showing up at the cross, wielding his influence in order to bury the body of the crucified Jesus. But just last night, well, he chose not to use his influence. He remained silent. So what happened in the last 12 hours to make him change his mind? And why didn't he speak up before Jesus went to the cross? Here's my theory. For Joseph's lack of courage at the trial, here's my theory. He's embedded. And when you're embedded, sure, you have influence, but you are also influenced. And that's lesson number 2. Beware, you are influenced. Joseph is embedded. He's on the inside. And when you're at the center on the inside, there are always other people there with you. There are guys in Joseph's circle with more seniority than him. Guys who pat him on the back and say, you're going places. Guys who tell him how to vote. Guys who explain the way things are so that the status quo isn't shaken up and Rome leaves them to their own decisions. This happens all the time, right? We might think it only happens at the top, like the president and the United States and his inner circle. But even when our circle isn't the circle, we still try to preserve our circle and those inside it. Let me say it like this. The Jewish people, they were marginalized by Rome. So here's Rome's circle. Jews are marginalized. No pious Jews were in any kind of position of power in the empire's politics. However, Rome's policy in Judea allowed them for some measure of self-governance. So while they're completely closed off from Roman circles of power and influence, they get their own little circle. And so from the margins, they build this, and inside of it are 71 embedded influencers. You know who isn't represented in that circle? Jesus, his followers, none of the 12, none of the named followers so far. Jesus and his followers, they're on the margins of the margins. They're not invited, they're firmly opposed. And I think this helps us understand who Joseph is, because he's at the center of Jewish power and influence. And it just isn't human nature to willingly move away from the center. For Joseph, merely being curious about Jesus on the outside could push him to the margins. We encounter this in countless ways in our own times, in our own lives. Think again about the circles where you're embedded and where you have influence, where you're at the center. But have you ever felt like a decision or a belief or an action could disqualify or uninvite you from that circle? Quite naturally, you're influenced by the status quo, by the way things are, by the traditions or the unspoken rules. And rather than being the influencer, at times you're just influenced. In the worst way, this is exemplified in the Jesus story. The Sanhedrin are the elites in Jerusalem, but they're the marginalized in the Roman Empire. And so when faced with a potential Messiah for their own people, they're almost rabid in their cries for his crucifixion because he's a threat to their own little power circle, a threat to their own influence. We see something like this happen in the history books when dictators come to power. Weak men and women whom the former government marginalized are quick to give loyalty to the new regime, and their newfound embedded status gives them influence over the people, and often that influence is violent and awful. I mean, read the stories of the Nazis and the Gestapo in concentration camps, you see this play out. And we think, oh my goodness, we would never act like that. We'd never violently oppose the marginalized in order to keep our embedded status, in order to have influence. I mean, we wouldn't, would we? In these United States, we wouldn't circle the wagons and keep all of them from influencing all of us. We wouldn't call them evil and thereby justify slander and hate. We wouldn't look at someone different than us and claim that their otherness must keep them out of our neighborhoods. We wouldn't cancel someone and push them out of our circle because they threatened to rupture the status quo. We wouldn't, would we? Be aware you have influence wherever you are embedded, but also beware you're influenced by the others in those circles. And it isn't easy to have the kind of influence that will challenge your circle. It isn't easy to take courage and speak up. It wasn't easy for Joseph of Arimathea. It wasn't easy for abolitionists living in the South. It wasn't easy for men who believed women should vote. It's not easy in our political climate to have civil discourse on both sides of the aisle. It's not easy to speak up, to stop gossip. It's not easy to be an embedded influencer. Ask Joseph. Ask Jesus. But there's another lesson that we learn from Joseph. Lesson number 3 is be prepared. You will be called out. Here's the thing about our God. He's a God who calls. He's a God who sends. He calls people out of something and sends them somewhere else. We see it throughout the scriptures. We see it throughout church history. Being an embedded influencer means being prepared for God to move you and call you. Think about Abraham, right? God called him out of his homeland, away from his family and his people and his culture. God promised that he would become a great nation and possess a great land and be a blessing to the whole world, but those weren't promises that Abraham personally saw fulfilled. God was just asking Abraham to move to the margin as the first step of obedience, the first step of a fulfilled promise. The whole time that God is building that nation in that land of Israel, he's also preparing them and calling them to move into the whole world with his good news. Think about Jonah. You remember this guy, right? God calls him out of his own land to send him to a pagan land, to Nineveh. But Jonah was nothing if not nationalistic, and he did not want to use his influence as a prophet to a place like Nineveh. No way. So he jumped on a ship, got tossed overboard in a storm, spent 3 days and nights in the belly of a whale, right? That shook him up enough to obey God, but he still wasn't happy about it. Nineveh was not his circle. Nineveh was not at the center of Israel's circle. And in Jonah's mind, Nineveh was firmly at the margins of God's love and should stay that way. And so when Nineveh repents and God extends mercy to them, Jonah whines about the character of God. He essentially says to him, I knew it. You are gracious and compassionate, slow to anger, abounding in love and faithfulness. And I knew that when I went to them, you would relent and forgive. This isn't a whole lot different from what the religious leaders were so mad about with Jesus. He's threatening their influence. He's suggesting that God's love and God's kingdom needed to move to the margins, that God was choosing both Jews and Gentiles to be at the center of his family. And that sounds dangerous. Remember that Mark tells us that Joseph was looking for the kingdom of God. Every time Mark has used this phrase, it's come from Jesus himself, but here he applies it to Joseph. And did Joseph see in Jesus the fulfillment of God's promise to bless the whole world? Did he find in Jesus' character, the same character displayed by God to the Ninevites, gracious and compassionate, slow to anger, abounding in love and faithfulness? Because why? Why would Joseph treat a crucified man like a member of his own family? What happened between Jesus' trial and death that changed Joseph's mind and gave him the courage to move from the center of power and influence to the margins? I wish we had more of Joseph's story, but we don't. We shouldn't speculate too much. The fact is that something or someone influenced Joseph with a greater influence than that wielded by the high priest. Someone was worth the risk of being canceled, shunned, and cut off from the in crowd. Someone gave Joseph a glimpse of a greater story, a better kingdom, and that same someone has designed your life on purpose for a purpose. And you may not expect it or like it, but at some point, I think that someone pushes all of us from center to margin, brings us into a new space, a new circle, embeds us in a new center. And the question is, will you let go of where you are and let God take you where he's leading? For Joseph, this was a 12-hour journey in which the crucified Christ redirected his calling and influence. For Paul, it was a sudden moment of confrontation with that risen Jesus that reversed his purpose from killing Christ's followers to making more of them. For those first Gentile followers of Jesus, it was a call to live a countercultural lifestyle in front of their neighbors. For St. Francis of Assisi, it was abandoning a life of luxury for commitment to poverty. For Martin Luther King Jr., it was a call from the pulpit to the streets, a call to call the church and society to reconciliation and justice, a call that cost him his life. All of them stepped out of their center, becoming influencers at the margins, and they changed the world around them. Now, you and I, we're not all called to something that high profile, but we are all called. Do you know right now where you are embedded? Are you aware that you have influence and that you are influenced there? Are you prepared to be called out? I spent some time considering what this has looked like in my own life, and I'll just dial back to high school for a moment. I was embedded in my church. I took my faith seriously, and I was a leader in my youth group. I was also embedded as an athlete, especially volleyball. My team was good. I was good. In both of these areas, people had hopes and expectations for me. And I disappointed those who'd hoped I'd go for a D1 or high-profile D2 or D3 school by choosing to play at an NAIA school that didn't even recruit me, Indiana Wesleyan University. Now, being a Christian had put me at the margins of the athletic community. So in going to college and majoring in Spanish and intercultural studies, code for missions, I thought I'd be at the center. But I quickly discovered that being an athlete in this school put me at the margins of the Christian ministries department. Because I must not be taking my faith seriously if I was spending my spare time in the gym rather than volunteering at a local church. It was interesting. Being embedded in one place put me at the margins of another. Now, that's not the only example of my life, but I share that one because whether you're young or old, at the beginning of a career or retiring soon, God may call you out of anywhere to the margins of anywhere. In the week of Passover in 30 or 33 AD, whenever it was, God called Joseph of Arimathea out. And at the foot of the cross, he looked up at the crucified Christ, and he made a decision that he would use his position and his influence and his resources to honorably bury the man called the King of the Jews. He may have been secretly following the ministry of Jesus up until now, but his actions on this night, well, they would be no secret because by Saturday morning, the rumor would be spreading that he had bought the cloth. He had gone to Pilate. He had taken down and transported Jesus' dead body, and he had put it in his own tomb. In other words, Joseph risked his reputation and position for a criminal, and everyone would know. Joseph would be out, no longer on the inside, marginalized. But the truth was that God called Joseph, and God put him right at the center of his story and his kingdom. What Joseph had been looking for all along, and it's a circle that I believed he remained in for the rest of his life. Joseph was an ordinary hero in the kingdom of God. And here's where I want to leave our big idea, is let Jesus be the greatest influence in your life. Because it is from the center of his story, from the center of his life and death and resurrection, that your God-given influence will flow. No matter how many spheres of influence you have where you live, work, learn, and play, the most important place to embed yourself is with Jesus, so that by the power of his Spirit, he can influence you to live out God's story every day, everywhere. He will open up new circles of influence, even as he pulls you to the margins of another circle. And that can be confusing, that can be difficult and isolating for a season, but it is where you find the confidence to say, I understand how God, because this is God's work, it's God's doing, it's God's story. I understand how God has purposely gifted and positioned me to multiply his work in the world. So 2 simple questions I want to put in front of all of us today, because we're all called to be embedded influencers and ordinary heroes like Joseph. And I challenge you to ask these questions every day and just see how God positions you to multiply his work in the world. Where has God placed me? And what is my next small step of obedience today? As we close Joseph of Arimathea's story, I want to turn our eyes again toward Jesus. In God's sovereign plan, Joseph brought Jesus' burial full circle with his birth. Born in a humble stable, swaddled in cloth by his mother Mary, Jesus was then honored as a king when the Magi from the east brought him gifts of gold, frankincense, and myrrh. And then here, after his shameful death on the cross, Joseph wrapped Jesus' body in cloth, placed him in a rich man's tomb, surrounded him with 75 pounds of costly spices, a burial worthy of a king. And so even here, at the darkest hour, when all is quiet and Jesus lies dead, even here, the good news is beginning to break in, because Jesus is indeed the King, and Sunday is coming.